Whoops.
So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our debate, first debate of the afternoon. Does app-based dating increase STD risk? I see that people are slowly filing in, but without further ado, we can jump into our pre-poll. I'm going to publish it now for you. Does app-based dating increase STD risk? Please go ahead and cast your vote. Polls will be open for 1 minute. Polls are still open, but it's time to be making up your mind. About 10 seconds to go. As you can see, there's a wide margin for the yes. App-based dating does increase STD risk. All right, the poll is closed. Our two debaters today, the pro side will be Dan Wolfeiler. He's the co-founder of Building Healthy Online Communities. That's a national consortium of HIV and STD prevention organizers working closely with the organizers of dating apps and websites to promote sexual health. He has worked for 33 years in HIV and STD prevention, including at the HIV Prevention Program of Catalonia, the World Health Organization, the Stop AIDS Project in San Francisco, and the California Department of Health's STD Control Branch. The con side will be taken by Lisa Hightower-Weidman. She is a professor of medicine and health behavior at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's been providing care to youth living with HIV or those at risk for HIV at UNC Chapel Hill since 2001. Dr. Hightower-Weidman is the director of the Behavior and Technology Lab, otherwise known as the BAT Lab at UNC, and she's an expert on the development and evaluation of technology-based interventions to address the HIV care continuum for youth and young adults, particularly sexual and gender minority populations. So aside from those introductions, our two debaters today can't agree on anything. Dan Wolfeiler likes men, Lisa Hightower-Weidman likes women. Dan likes Trevor Noah, Lisa is a Rachel Maddow fan. Dan hates patchouli, even though he's from Berkeley and he isn't afraid to say so. And Lisa also hates patchouli, but as a card-carrying lesbian, she must deny this. He's sure he's right, and she's quite sure he's wrong. And so with that, we will let our two debaters present their arguments.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom. And whoops. I really want to thank you for inviting me to do this debate, but I have to say this question is pretty useless. And we don't have very good data, we won't get very good data, and it doesn't really make any difference. So Lisa, have a great time. I'm going to take off.
Great. So this is not unlike him to leave midway through coitus, or I guess presenting interruptus, I'll say, but oh, he's back. Never mind, sorry.
I didn't want this to be like a grinder date where the guy says he's going to show up and then just doesn't. So I'm not going to leave you in the lurch.
All right.
So I want to talk a little bit about the facts of life. We talk about the facts of life when we talk about sex, and we also have to accept that dating apps are also a fact of life. They're here to stay, and furthermore, 3/4 of MSM in the United States use the apps. But I also want to say, before we burden ourselves and our communities with answering a question like this, we should ask, if data show that apps do increase rates, what would we do? And if data show that apps do not increase rates, what do we do then? And we have to answer that question before we ask anything else. We have to keep in mind that any epi data that we collect and any surveys that we conduct with our populations, we need to think about what the programmatic outcome would be before we set all that in motion. So Bill Haddon was an epidemiologist and the first chief of the National Highway and Safety Traffic Institute. And he was the one who mandated that automobile companies incorporate seatbelts in their design and in every car. And he didn't have a randomized controlled trial to base that decision on, but he said later that this was the one thing he was convinced of that saved more lives. And the point of this is to say sometimes you can't wait for data, particularly if we don't think we're going to get good data to take action. So there's been many, many, many years of research that show that app users are at greater risk for STDs than non-app users. And Mary McFarland, who should win a prize for being probably the funniest government employee, should also win a prize for writing back in 2000 that internet sex seekers in Denver reported more previous STDs, more partners, more anal sex, and more sexual exposure to men. And Hernagle in 2019 did a similar study in San Diego. And lo and behold, he found similar results: higher risk sex acts, more male partners, more condomless sex in the past year, and higher rates of STDs. So we now have 20 years of data answering this question, and I can go back and get more coffee. But instead of doing that, I'll continue and show Rachel Katcher's data. And what she was able to look at it nationally through the National Survey of Family Growth was that guys who met partners online, look at those blue bars, were more likely to have 2 or more male oral sex partners, 2 or more male anal sex partners, more but not significantly, not statistically significant, condomless anal sex with a male partner, but much more likely to test positive for an STI. She also found what appears to be good news, which was that guys who met partners online were more likely to get a sexual risk assessment and more likely to be tested for STIs. But she also cautioned that we shouldn't get too excited about this positive result, because if you'll notice, almost half of the guys in the survey never got a sexual risk assessment and never got tested for STIs, and we have a long way to go. And she also included this gem, which was all data reported from the perspective of the respondent, so it's not possible to infer information about sexual networks, and therein lies the rub. So many years ago, when I first started working in this area, I went to Ed Lauman, who's the leading sociologist of sexual behavior in the US and probably the world. And I asked him what he thought the impact of dating apps and sites would be on STD rates. And he said, well, the most important thing to remember is that the internet is a network. And it was one of those sort of elegant, simple statements that is important to keep in mind as you're doing this work. And I want to show you some of the ways this plays out. So I want to go back a slide. So Chris O'Leary back in 2008 mapped out, to my knowledge, the first map of a sexual network on Manhunt. And what you can see is the 3 red dots that sort of go diagonally across your screen are guys who had syphilis and HIV. And as you can see, they had lots of partners. And then there's some guys who had fewer partners. Now, Chris tragically died at the age of 34. And it's an honor for me to continue to honor him by presenting this data. And I like to think that were he still alive, he would have advanced this field much, much further than we are now. So I want to talk about some other data that point to the impact of networks and point to the impact of dating apps on networks. First, back to Mary McFarland's work, she showed that only 2% of the people meeting partners offline had 20 more partners, and yet 17% of people meeting partners online had 20 more partners. And those are pretty much those guys in the red dots that you saw on Chris's slide. What Chris also pointed out was that MSM were at the most 2 degrees of separation from someone with syphilis. So again, there's the impact of what the internet does to networks and what networks do to sexual transmission of STDs. So because this is a national debate, it's a national project, it's important to think, well, does this play out the same way in epicenters and in rural areas? So for many, many years, as I've been giving presentations similar to this, I've been saying, well, Wyoming has no gay bars, so apps are a really good way to meet people and they're much safer. And so I called up one of the gay community leaders in Wyoming, and he said, that's still true all these years later. And he said, furthermore, that every time they get a visitor from someone out of town, the first thing they do is go on the apps and see who's around to date. The apps do have one benefit, which is you no longer need to drive to Denver to meet a guy, which means less smog and less climate change. And I think Lisa and I, this is something else we would agree that's a good thing. So what's the impact on STDs, which is what we're supposed to be debating? Well, as I was talking to the guy I was mentioning before, one of the main people in Epi in Wyoming was in the car, and she said, well, I don't know, because I don't have time to enter data about where cases have met, something that most of us would say in this field. And she said, the other thing that we're constantly telling each other when we're trying to explain why rates go up, could be the risk behavior, could be treatment, could be apps. In urban areas like San Francisco, well, we already had lots of venues. We had plenty of gay bars already, at least before COVID. We had numerous sex clubs, at least before COVID. And probably every visitor that comes here also goes on the apps. What's the impact on STD rates in urban areas? Well, we keep writing the same thing on our progress reports and on our data reports and in our talks, and we keep saying, could be the risk behavior, could be HIV treatment, or could be the apps that account for greater transmission. And one reason the apps undoubtedly do have an impact is because they're so much cheaper and therefore so much more available to MSM everywhere. So to go to a bathhouse is going to cost at least $20 a visit. To go to a bar, you can spend easily $30 a night as you're sitting there looking at other guys and trying to meet one. And apps range from absolutely nothing. Many of them are free. And if you want apps which include features that you're not going to get advertising, you can spend up to $30 a month. So the supply's there, the demand's going to be there to meet.
All right.
And with that, Lisa, it's all yours.
Thank you. That was great. I'm going to say why I don't think apps are actually the enemy. The subtitle of "Don't Hate the Player or the Game." So, we've been here before, and anytime there is sort of a new technology or technological innovation, the conversation kind of moves towards attributing promiscuity to that technology. And so, this is information on birth control and sex education, where, again, both in both instances, we realize that, providing birth control and providing holistic and comprehensive sex education doesn't make folks have more sex. And so I think app blaming is really kind of misguided and
Uh-oh.
provided outreach, testing, and treatment. And finding sex partners online is not new, and neither are STIs. So if you look kind of through the time-space continuum, finding sex online really started, back in the 80s through kind of chat-based approaches and chat rooms, and obviously there's been it was a huge increase when Grindr appeared on the scene in 2009, but. To attribute STIs fully to the apps, again, I think seems kind of a little misguided and really conflates correlation with causation. So we've had a lot of changes in testing practices, moving from symptomatic screening only to more screening based on events or behaviors or just kind of prevention. And with the rise of PrEP and the recommendations to increase STI testing, we certainly are catching more STIs. In addition, there's differences in testing practices. And as I think, eloquently shown by my debate partner, app using men may engage in more prevention behaviors, including more STI and HIV testing. And so we may be finding more. And I would strongly say that we should continue to test more, even if we find more. And this holds for STIs as well as other recent diseases in the news. And then how good is this this literature? You know, it really kind of shows this rise of STIs. Well, this is a review article from 2017. And, you know, when you look at these 13 articles from 11 studies, there was major methodological problems that really limit our ability to directly attribute a rise in STIs to the apps. Most of the studies were descriptive. They didn't have a comparison group. So again, can't ascertain if it was the apps as a risk factor. Most study samples were limited and selective, so perhaps recruiting a group of folks that are more sexually active and certainly limits the generalizability. And study outcomes are self-reported. So again, if folks are testing more, they may self-report more STIs. And I'll sort of do a tale of kind of two hypotheses. So the accentuation hypothesis, as put forth by my opponent, is that the internet is the environment which expands access to sex partners and thus is going to increase the prevalence of sexual activity and the likelihood of unsafe sex. I would hone to the self-selection hypothesis, where that men prone to engage in more risky sex may be more likely than men who practice safer sex to use the apps. The app users may be more sexually active to begin with. And again, high-risk men may gravitate more towards apps as an additional venue. And data to support this comes from multiple studies, and I think, you know, is in somewhat contradiction to what was presented, in that these studies found that many MSM who seek partners online are also seeking partners offline and reporting more offline partners. While app users were more likely to have STIs in one study that didn't use the apps, they were also having more sex overall, even absent of the apps. And again, among a sample of app users, even within the apps, there are different users that may be using them more or less. And in this study, those with low self-control were significantly more likely to report more sex partners. So again, I would say that we do not have large longitudinal studies that really kind of look at use over time and STI HIV incidence over time, controlling for all of the other factors that impact increasing STI incidence. And I think context also matters. And I think it can be obscured when we simply blame the apps. And this was a great study by Goodell and Duncan, which really looked at the context of app users. And in this study, most of the condomless, receptive, and anal intercourse was being had by folks who were using the apps while they were high or drunk, using marijuana, alcohol, or other drugs. And so, you know, I would say that, again, should we be shifting our focus to address substance use or other issues, mental health, other things that impact safer sex practices among MSM who use the apps, rather than simply blaming the apps? And again, you know, I think we can't discount the fact that there are have been some movements, again, most put forth by, again, my opponent, to try and make the apps kind of a more safe and stigma-free environment. And again, while not all of the apps offer this, there are, in many of them, testing reminders or profile options, or again, ways to kind of disclose status, talk about status, talk about testing. And, you know, this doesn't mean that users should not continue to demand more from apps. You know, even though the cost may be less than bars, there's still a cost, and users should demand that these apps put investments in their health.
Okay, I now get to provide my rebuttal to, and I'm going to try and go to the echo. So I want to turn the rebuttal a little bit on its head and say, what would it take to make very sure I lose this debate in the future? And I'm going to talk about condoms, advertising, better partner notification, more frequent testing for app users, and more community advocacy. And what does that mean? Can we get it? So one of the things we need to do, if I'm going to lose in the future, is make sure that every app includes condoms as an option. And building healthy online communities, we've been working really hard with all the apps to make sure they include information that allows users to both broadcast their sexual health strategies, as well as set a norm that makes these, it's basically free advertising, makes them more popular, and also helps other users make a decision. So those include condoms, whether you're on PrEP, whether you have an undetectable viral load, what your HIV status is. We've also been working with the apps to include testing reminders. And as you can see, most of the apps do most of this. But if you notice, Grindr and Hornet do not include condoms as an option. And that's one of the most important strategies when it comes to STDs. We know that Grindr is reconsidering that. Hornet, I'm not sure where they are. We also need to lower advertising costs. Advertising is incredibly expensive. To get just ads viewed can be incredibly cheap at the top of this chart. But if you look at the bottom, it cost us here in a recent experiment, depending on which platform and how we bought them, between $2,000 and $5,000 to get one person to chat with a health advocate and be driven to PrEP or be guided to PrEP. We've also got to improve home testing, and we've been developing a project, and we've launched it some months ago called Take Me Home, and that's being promoted by Grindr and some other apps. And we've so far shipped out 2,000 HIV kits to 5 states and 19 tests. So we need to expand that by about 100-fold. We also need to improve partner notification. Our original dream was to have partner notification built into the apps. We're not going to get there, so we've built platforms that you have to go off the app to do to notify your partner that you may have been exposed to an STD, and this is called tellyourpartner.org. We also need to be thinking much more strategically about how we work with the private sector. There's very little community advocacy around venues, and people keep saying we need the community to take action before health departments can take action. That's not going to happen. We also need to come to terms with the fact that unlike nutrition, unlike cancer, unlike injury, we've been very reticent in our field to engage with the private sector, much less confront them. And finally, a lot of people have been saying, well, why don't we litigate? Why can't we hold the companies responsible? And what we have in this country is the Communications Decency Act, which has protected dating sites from lawsuits where plaintiffs have claimed that harm resulted for now. And we have to wait to see how that holds up. So with that, I'll let Lisa have her shot.
All right. So I think, again, Dan makes some great points, but, I still think I'm right. So, I think, the first part is that, we can't just say, that more sex equals more STIs, right? So more sex can lead to higher risk of infection. And I love this study. It was, or this infographic. It was made by a group that does gambling percentages and gambling odds, which is something one of my vices, and did show that there was an increased risk of STIs per sex act. But at the individual level, if you're using condoms, if you're getting tested regularly, it doesn't have to be the case. And so I would argue that practicing safe sex is the key to staying healthy, not having less sex. And it's less important to me, and I think hopefully to the public health, where people meet partners than what they do when they meet them. And so I think we need to continue to put forth information so that everyone has the skills and information to stay healthy. And an example, based on my own personal experience during COVID is, you have a sex app, a sex seeking app, and it does make more, sex, more available, straight to your door. To me, that would be like I'm blaming Grubhub for the extra, poundage that I've put on because I can order whatever I want to my door. I could order healthy foods. I could not order food. I could cook. A lot of things I could do, but my behavior is not the fault of Grubhub. And app use is universal, and I saw this come in the Q&A. So if we're going to focus on apps to increase sex and STIs, why are we only focusing on men having sex with men? Why are we not focusing on other relationships and sex that's having? And I found a bunch of very interesting sites that again, I think they're pretty self-explanatory. And when you look at the rise of meeting partners on apps for same-sex and heterosexual couples, it's basically continuing to go up. And I would just say that apps can facilitate more than just sex. And I think in the heteronormative world where we live, where anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes are still and continue to be on the rise, we need to acknowledge that for for youth or other folks who are coming out, particularly in areas that maybe more have more stigma and less venues. Apps can eliminate some of the anxiety of wondering if the person you're matching with is gay or just somebody who happens to look gay. And that can be more than just impact mental health, but can actually impact obviously their physical health as well. And so I would argue that technology isn't the iceberg, it's just the tip. And ultimately, we use technology and online dating because we crave connections. The desire is timeless, it will connect us. Users can and demand more from apps, including greater investments, but the tenacity with which we will seek each other out and find ways to have sex as a healthy part of our lives is really inspiring, and we will find whatever means to maximize our connections. So I think we both first want to just say that the opinions put forth by both of us were not necessarily the opinions we hold, but hopefully gave you a good debate. And we certainly thank the conference users, the app users and non-users who've participated in all of this research, particularly to app owners who value community sexual and mental health and take actions to address this, to the Building Healthy Communities group. That's our time. So I think we may have a minute for questions. I don't know if Tom wanted to ask any of them or do another poll.
Tom, we can't hear you.
Does Tom want to do another poll? I don't think the results of the first poll were published, so maybe you could tell people what the first poll was and publish the second one. See if I made up any ground.
So we do have time for one question. Let's see what was in the box.
There was a question about, is there data breaking down app users by race, ethnicity, or gender, or by sexual identity? There are some data. And also, here's Tom back.
Yes.
And I also think it's important for health departments to be looking closely at what data they have, particularly for the populations that are most affected. Tom, you're back?
Yes, I apologize for my technical difficulties. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe next time I won't get rid of my camera. But yes, the pre-poll was 79% yes, 21% no. And I did want to mention an important disclaimer, like in all of our debates, the positions the debaters have taken today are not necessarily those that they hold themselves. And we now have time for our concluding poll. It is now open. Our app-based dating has increased STD risk, yes or no? The poll will be open for 60 seconds.
Maybe we could sing the Jeopardy song while we're doing this.
My free public service announcement, not the views of the CDC, but my own.
Yes, and we're just about at time. So as you can see, there has been a shift in opinion. It was formerly yes, 79%. Now it's yes, 67%. Roughly from about 4 out of 5 saying yes, now it's more like 2/3 saying yes. So we will call that a clear swing in favor of the no position. Thank you all for attending today, and there is another debate.
Congratulations, Lisa.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been really fun. So please email if you have any questions or anything you need.